Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show. I am honored now to introduce Francis X. Rocca, Wall Street Journal reporter at the Vatican, one of the best and most reliable Vaticanistas that there is, and no stranger to this show. He's been on several times. Always a pleasure to speak to him directly from Rome. Frank, welcome back to the show.
Ed, thank you very much. Always a pleasure and an honor.
Well, it's interesting here, and I think that first off, you've got a great piece up right now at the Wall Street Journal. Russia's war rages, putting Ukraine's cultural sites at risk. And I think that this is one of the nuances of war that people forget. And we kind of went through this a little bit with Iraq, where we had some of the antiquities that were looted out of Iraq, sometimes by American troops, and spent years trying to get these things back to Iraq. I mean, war does terrible things to art, to other cultural treasures, and I think it's important for us to focus on how how we should mitigate this. So I think tell us a little bit about where you're going in this piece as well.
Well, I should say thank you very much, but you should say that I was the co-writer on this piece, but the
right.
principal reporter was my colleague Isabel Coles, who's there in Lviv, and a part of a team of people from our paper who are right in the thick of things. So excuse me, sorry, there was an air raid siren. I have to get back to you. That kind of. It's really sobering because I'm sitting here at home, so happy to make phone calls and so forth. But they're in the war zone. But yeah, I mean the concern is obviously I think twofold. One is that when buildings burn down, if they're containing art masterpieces, then those are lost, or if bombs fall in the wrong place. But then there's also the other consideration, which is that if they survive, will they be looted? Will they be taken? That's happened over and over again. The Russians took hundreds of thousands of objects in the Second World War, and some of them real masterpieces that are sitting in their museums. And they took things from Ukraine even earlier, when Ukraine was absorbed into the Soviet Union, and there were persecution of the church, a lot of religious art. So that's a twofold concern. There was the question also, well, should you move these things out of the country? But I think part of the problem is that they've got other priorities at the moment, like trying to meet people out of the country. And also then there's the question is, if you are driving trucks to the border of Poland, then, and the trucks get hit. So one curator told my colleague, well, look, maybe better to preserve them. And if the worst happens and the Russians steal them, at least they exist and we can get them back diplomatically someday, rather than have them be destroyed. So it's a dilemma.
Well, it's not just the movable art pieces, right? I mean, this is something that I think we as Americans don't experience unless we travel, and we're not necessarily the best at being world travelers. But when you're in places like Lviv or Kyiv or Kharkiv, and certainly in places like Rome, one of my favorite cities in the world, the art isn't just what's hanging on the walls. It's not just what's up on a pedestal. I mean, the buildings themselves are art. I mean, when you're in Rome, and you certainly know this because you've been there for a very long time, you're really living in art. You're living in architectural art. You're living in history. And dropping bombs on this, on places like this, means that a lot of that is going to be destroyed, and it will never come back. You can build a new building in these places, but the art, the architectural history, just the lived history is destroyed, and that's one of the things that's at risk in this war as well.
Yeah, that's right. I believe Warsaw. I've never been to Warsaw. Krakow is still very, very well preserved, as you probably know. But Warsaw, I believe, was largely destroyed in the war, and that's just one city. And even in Italy, there was a city. I mean, there's so much of the past. Rome was pretty much spared. Happily. But yeah, I mean, there's this Hague Convention, 1954 Hague Convention, to which both Russia and Ukraine are signatories, that they pledge not to target cultural heritage, and there's this so-called blue shield emblem that they're going around, they're putting on sort of key buildings. But it was pointed out that for example, in the Balkan Wars, sometimes those actually made buildings a target. they had the opposite effect, that you had soldiers, targeting buildings. So obviously, I mean, I mean, it may seem to some people that that's a minor consideration compared to like maternity hospitals getting bombed and so forth. Obviously, that human life is unique, uniquely valuable. But this is another casualty. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not arguing about this in terms of this is a higher priority, but it is a consideration. It's one of the things that we are going to lose.
Yeah,
as a result of this war. It's not as important as the human lives that are being lost, the infrastructure that's being lost, but it is still important. And I think that it's good that you and Isabel Coles and your team of very brave reporters from the Wall Street Journal are at least giving us a chance to reflect on that.
Yeah, and it's the national heritage too, and that's right, because that's something that obviously Putin has made very clear he doesn't respect. He doesn't believe that Ukraine has a distinct national heritage. So a lot of this art is very important to that cultural, it's cultural heritage, right? So the fear that this would either get destroyed or taken is part of that fear that they're going to be erased.
Exactly, and that's the purpose of this war is Vladimir Putin wants to erase Ukrainian nationality, and as you just pointed out, and succeeding in this would mean succeeding in one of his major war aims, and it's important for us to try to protect against that to the best of our ability and to the best of the West's ability. Now, Frank, I want to turn to what's going on between the various churches in Europe, including the Vatican, and in relation to this war. And I think that this is something that really hasn't been a major focus, I think, because of course we're mostly focused again on what the combatants are doing, the Ukrainians, the inspirational leadership of Volodymyr Zelensky, Vladimir Putin's insanity, or at least debates over that. But the churches here are trying to play a role, and it's very complicated. I know that the Pope Francis was trying to build bridges with the Russian Orthodox Church. The churches in Europe have had some reactions to this. What is the current status of the Vatican's position here on this war, and what are the players involved, and how are these interests playing out?
Well, I mean, the Vatican's position has obviously been, as you would expect, has been peace, no war.
Right.
The language has gotten stronger. It's been, by comparison with other Western leaders, Western governments, it's been very restrained. But when the actual invasion happened, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, who's the Secretary of State, who's the second after the Pope, basically, talked about the beginning of military operations on Ukrainian territory or something like that, which is a very bloodless, really kind of understated way of talking about an invasion, which and kind of almost it really echoed the Russian propaganda actually, and the Pope confined himself to talking about war is bad and this is war is a tragic thing, but it could have been, and this is something that the Ukrainians have complained about or in the past about the Pope, is that it could have been a civil war he was talking about, which it could have been. It wasn't necessarily clear that there was one side that was to blame and the other was simply fighting a justified defensive war. And then his language has gotten strong, and then he did a very typically sort of ambiguous and sort of flashy thing, or flashy is not quite the right word, but impressive sort of a thing, which is he went to the Russian embassy,
right,
very short, I think the day after the invasion, but they didn't say what he said, because ordinarily the Pope would never go to the embassy. He would call the ambassador if he's concerned about something, call him in, say, come to me, summon him. But he went himself, but the only thing the Vatican would say was that he went to express his concern about the war. So again, finally on Sunday, he said he talked about an unacceptable armed aggression. So now he used strong language too. He talked about barbaric bombing of women and children in maternity hospitals, and he talked about he was clearly he was clearly appealing to Russia to stop the thing,
Right.
to stop the invasion. So his language is strong, but the closest he got to actually, he sort of, I don't know. I mean, a lot of people are not satisfied yet. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
It's still pretty bloodless language compared to the Archbishop of Canterbury or to the other Western political leaders.
So, I mean, this is what's interesting about this to me is that, you know, of course, Pope Francis has been working for years, again, to build bridges to the various Orthodox churches, but including the Russian Orthodox Church. He traveled to Havana, Cuba to meet with Patriarch Kirill and to sort of support, or at least offer sort of vague terms of support for Kirill's patriarchy over the broader Orthodox Church in that region, which would have included Ukraine. I think as an effort, a millennium long effort, right, to heal the breach between the Roman Catholic Church and the various Orthodox churches. This now has become, though, a huge blow up among the Orthodox churches. Of course, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is now rejecting Kirill's leadership. You've got the Patriarch of Constantinople that has sided with the Ukrainians on this. So it's become a bigger rift than maybe it's been in quite a long time. Is the Vatican still trying to calculate this on the basis of the interest of Christian unity, Orthodox Christian unity, or maybe apostolic Christian unity? Or are they turning a corner now on this and saying this might just be a situation where Kirill is just too co-opted into the Russian system to be able to negotiate on that basis?
Well, they haven't said anything like that openly, and I don't know. I don't see any indication that. I mean, I think. Right. So the Russian Orthodox Church is the single largest and most powerful church in the Eastern Orthodoxy. And it's the one that's most resistant to ecumenism and to dealing with Rome for various reasons, historical reasons, and the Pope has been very obliging and very deferential in his attempt to. He got that meeting. He got that meeting in 2016 in Havana that you mentioned with Kirill, which was the first time that a Pope had ever met with a Russian Orthodox patriarch. But he disappointed a lot of Catholics in Ukraine, whose position has historically been very difficult, and because they felt that the statement he signed with Kirill in 2016 both kind of played down the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And remember, the Vatican never spoke out against the annexation of Crimea, actually, either in 2014. But also, it seemed to the language that they thought kind of diminished the importance of their own Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine, the church that's been loyal to Rome for centuries, because the Russians really don't like them. I mean, they really don't like their presence. They think it's sheep stealing. It's just so. The head of I'm getting into the weeds maybe, but the head of the Greek or of the Ukrainian Catholic Church said that the Ukrainian Catholics felt betrayed, and the Pope I don't think the Pope was happy about that. I think now you're right. He's in a real dilemma. Because the whole point of all this outreach was ecumenism, but now if the Eastern Orthodox are fighting among themselves, I mean, Kirill won't pray for Bartholomew, who's considered the first among equals among Eastern Catholic bishops, right? Because he recognized this autonomous, technically autocephalous church in Ukraine. Now still most of the Ukrainian Orthodox are still associated with Moscow officially. But in the recent weeks, we're hearing some of their clergy speak up and saying that they'd like to maybe join this autonomous Ukrainian church. So you're right. I mean, will the popes, if the Pope is seen too deferential to Kirill's sensibilities, will that alienate the other Eastern Orthodox? On the other hand, Kirill is totally on board with Putin. I mean, he has justified this war both geopolitically and culturally. he created a kerfuffle, a little while ago when he said, "Oh, well, look what they're trying to do in Ukraine. The West, they want to have gay pride parades.
Right.
That's why we're fighting this war." So, which is certainly not Francis's approach to talk to even metaphorical culture wars, not literal culture wars with bombs, but. So it's a real dilemma. So in other words, I don't have an answer. I don't know what they're going to do, but I would be surprised if he comes out and just criticizes Kirill or explicitly names Russia.
How about the rest of the Vatican hierarchy? I know Parolin, Cardinal Parolin had something started speaking a little bit more harshly about the invasion. I'm trying to recall exactly what it was that he said. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be coming from Pope Francis in order to get the point made. And are you hearing more about this? And I'm just pulling this up right now while we're speaking, Frank, because I forgot to pull this up earlier. But he says, this was more about Kirill than it was about Russia. And he says, Kirill's words do not favor or promote an agreement. This was after two sermons, right? There was the March 5th sermon in which he justified the war sort of on vaguer terms. Then there was I believe, another sermon on March the 9th that got into what you just mentioned, the whole gay pride parade thing and the decadence of the West. And Cardinal Parolin said that Kirill's words do not favor or promote an agreement. Instead, they risk heightening spirits toward escalation and not solve the crisis peacefully. And that's the same. Yeah.
That's a good point. He did say that. He did distance himself from that, and presumably he was speaking for the Pope. You're right.
So I mean, there's a little bit of a at least a brushback pitch, I guess, that the Vatican is sending a signal there, and I think in this might be, and you're a better judge of this than I am. I mean, other ecclesial organizations in Europe have taken a strong stand. I don't want to necessarily say it's a much stronger stand, but a more specific stand about Kirill and calling him out for his support for the war. How important is it for the Vatican to be in alignment with some of these other ecclesial organizations, councils of bishops and that sort of thing, throughout the rest of Europe?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think, there are people who have complained increasingly. I haven't heard church leaders complaining about the Pope openly, but I'm saying is you do see, people in the press and even people who are very supportive of Pope Francis, not necessarily, just disgruntled conservatives who are sort of reaching for something.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Wipe at him, but also just actually people who are very, very sincere, very celebratory of his pontificate, who are disappointed. To what extent that affects their view of him or how it affects his influence? I don't know. I wish I had a better answer. I think if his language continues to get stronger, I think probably. That would be enough. I mean, I don't think that people are going to criticize him. Religious leaders are going to criticize him openly for that. I think their usual way of dealing is very diplomatic with each other, and I think that it's understood that the Russian case is very peculiar because this, the Kremlin and the Patriarchate are so closely connected. I mean,
right.
So anyway, I don't know that the Pope I don't know that if he feels heat to do that from that end.
Well, what do you? So it's sort of like a final thought here. It almost sounds to me like Pope Francis is trying to remain in a position to help broker some sort of peace. And it wouldn't be the first time, that the Vatican has a very long and rich and diplomatic history. They have a power that far exceeds their physical presence in the world, mostly on the basis of, moral authority and the basis of having 1.2 billion Catholics around the world. And so no one should ever underestimate the potential for the Vatican to enter into a diplomatic mode and try to negotiate between hostile combatants. It seems like that's kind of what Pope Francis has been trying to do all along, is to leave the Vatican open as a forum for this. And I'm not sure, I mean, I'm not asking you to say how successful that would be, but do you see any signs that that's getting some resonance, and maybe there's some back channel connections or some rumors of work in that direction at the Vatican? Because as long as he doesn't pick a side, it does sort of lend itself to being that sort of forum.
Well, yeah, maybe. I don't know. I don't know. A, which is probably the most important thing to say, but
right.
B, I don't know that the Russians would think of him as a necessarily totally neutral person, even though, as
good point.
I mean, there are Catholics in Ukraine. There aren't really any Catholics in Russia, you know, the Russians have always seen the Church of Rome as kind of, you know, they've had a kind of, to put it mildly, an adversarial relationship over in history. So I don't know, but a lot about neutrality. There was something I wanted to say. Now I remember about the historical perspective on this. Since really the beginning of the 20th century, since Benedict XV tried in vain to stop with this First World War. The position of the Vatican has very much been of, you know, peace, which it wasn't always the case, because the Vatican, the popes were made war in
right.
history. They had armies and so forth, but that's not true anymore. And through the whole 20th century, the Vatican's position was always, you know, peace and also kind of a neutrality. And of course, the extreme situation was the Second World War with Pius XII, and we're still arguing about that, right?
Right.
You know, where, oh my God, he really, you know, people say, well, he really should have taken a side, because there was clearly a bad, you know, a worse side, and so forth. And so I think that's part of it too. We have to widen the perspective beyond Francis. I think the idea is, and that helps explain. I think that is a factor why, you know, you say war, evil, barbaric bombing, and so forth. But he doesn't want to say, he reluctant to say, okay, but it's their fault. Even though, I mean, you know, if you connect the dots, he is saying there's an aggressor and then there's a victim.
Right.
But I think there's also that. There's also this idea that, you know, war is not the solution, and therefore you don't want to take sides and say, okay, well, I want this guy to win and this guy to lose, even though it would obviously be better if one side won than the other. Anyway, I don't know if that helps, but I think that's also a factor which is beyond the precise, particular issues involving Russia.
I think that's great. I mean, again, this is, you know, the Vatican is a really interesting and nuanced place, and I think it helps when we see, you know, perspectives that are somewhat different and than our own, and I think that you're right. Right. I think that this is you know, their message for the last century has just been peace, 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 peace. And I think legitimately so. And I think it's an interesting comparison in the end to Kirill, who apparently is championing a war. And that's the reason why you have this dislocation now between the Russian Orthodox, well, at least the Russian Orthodox leadership of the church and the rest of the Christian church in Europe. Worth noting too is that even some Russian Orthodox clerics, I think it was, last count was close to 300, signed a letter objecting to Kirill's leadership on this. So that's probably worth watching as well. But
yeah, although that is true, but my understanding is that a large number, if not the majority of those, are actually outside of Russia. I think so. It was organized by a priest in Madrid, Russian Orthodox priest in Madrid. And a lot, and so it was. That doesn't take away from their value of what they're saying, but you can see why it'd be a lot harder for people in Russia to do that.
Oh, indeed, yeah.
Yeah. So, and in many cases, I'm told these Russian Orthodox priests have congregations with lots of Ukrainians. So it's significant, but it's not quite a revolt. It's not like Kirill's clergy is revolting and saying, you know, we're right.
Right. Well, that's a good perspective on that too. So I mean, that's something that there's not been a lot of media coverage on this angle. So I mean, to the extent that you've got that sort of insight, absolutely, this is it's great to hear this. And I'm going to try to keep an eye on this. And of course, if you want to keep an eye on all of these things, the best thing to do is to follow Frank on Twitter, francis.x.rocca. I think at francis.x.rocca. Is that correct?
There's no dots. It's
that's right. Francis X Rocca, just all together.
Yeah.
I'm confusing that, I think, with your. Well, I don't want to say that. Yeah. I don't want to put that in the open.
My email address is public. It's on the website.
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah, it's francis.rocca.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, in fact, I'm looking at it now. It's in your Twitter bio. So, yeah.
I met journalists who's like, "Oh, I won't give up my cell phone number." I'm like, "You're a journalist. You should want everybody to have your cell phone number." But anyway.
Yeah, buy a personal one. Have a professional one. Buy a personal one. All right. Well, we'll follow him at Francis X Rocca, ROCCA, and of course, if you're not subscribing to the Wall Street Journal, maybe you should do that as well. I subscribe, and I get a chance to read everything that Frank's writing, and you should read everything that Frank's writing. Frank, again, thank you so much for doing this. Great information, and wish you the best in Rome, and we'll hopefully get you back on here lots and lots to talk more about what's going on at the Vatican.
Thank you, Ed.
All right, folks, stay tuned for more from the Ed Morrissey Show. Coming right back. This is Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com for Town Hall. Do 6 in 10 Americans really support teaching children below the age of 10 about sexual orientation and gender identity? That's what ABC News and Ipsos want readers to believe from its latest polling, but their methodology exposes this as yet another media narrative stunt. By their own admission, the poll oversamples LGBTQ respondents in its too small number of adults rather than registered voters. It appears that ABC and Ipsos polled specifically where they could expect opposition to be strongest, in selected urban areas, as a means to rebuke Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. DeSantis will sign a bill that prohibits instruction on sexual orientation before the 4th grade, keeping sex education efforts focused instead on basic human biology. DeSantis appears to have a better sense of parental opinion in Florida than ABC would like you to believe. We all need to watch carefully as media companies cook up surveys, like this one, in order to push a narrative rather than measure public opinion. I'm Ed Morrissey. Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast edition. Joining me as always on Tuesdays, Andrew Malcolm, the Prince of Twitter, the Regent of RedState.com. How are you doing? And he's either Statler or Waldorf. I don't remember which one I am, but he's the other one.
Well, you're the tall one. Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't. Yeah. I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. You know, I get a chance to do this with you every week, and I don't have to sling Vladimir Putin's hash in these podcasts. We're going to get into lots of different topics here, probably media related and Joe Biden related most of all. But before we get going, I gotta play this clip because it just came up. We're recording this on Monday afternoon. It just came up on Twitter. Now, Vladimir Putin passed a law. And I want to talk to you about journalism in the Putin, in the post-Ukraine era here, because there's there's another interesting story about that. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Andrew.
No, they don't have cloture there, I guess.
Well, Vladimir Putin passed a law that said you can't refer to the war. It's a special military operation, and you better talk nice about it, or else they're arresting people on the street just for doing Vox Populi interviews. That even sort of kind of dissented, in some cases not even dissent from this. But I got to play this one clip. This is from Channel 1 News, and the person you're going to see holding up a sign here is actually a producer at Channel 1. This is an official state media channel. Let's go ahead and just move over to that, and I'll go ahead and click play.
Подчеркнул, надо усилить сотрудничество в рамках союзного государства, а на совещании в правительстве обсуждали, как сохранить доступность лекарств.
So, yeah, the sign there behind the presenter, Andrew, and Andrew didn't get a chance to see this, but the sign behind the presenter said, "No war, This is propaganda. You're being lied to. It is probably not anyone's big surprise that her very next appearance was at the local Russian police station, where she's about to be prosecuted, apparently, for that for that editorial comment in the middle of the Channel 1 news. Andrew, I mean, this is they're playing for keeps over in Russia.
Oh yeah. Yeah, well, you know, we bitch and vetch about the American media, but the fact is, as bad as they can be at times, it's much better than in other places. And we talk about tyranny here, but there's no tyranny like in other places. It just yep. Doesn't even, it's not even in the same ballpark. When I was covering Asia back in the 70s, it was a dictatorship in Korea. Park Chung-hee, the former general, and they had secret police following me. And well, they weren't so secret if I could see them, but and who I talked to, and then they would go and try to intimidate cab drivers not to take me. There were guys jailed for dissent. And one of the dissenters that I would meet with in the evenings and talk to him about life in Korea, he said, look, don't let happen in your country what we do here. Make sure you vote. And I always vote anyway, but it's a good warning. You know, I mean, we take it for granted, but we have it very, very good and very, very safe. With all the problems and all the anger and dissent, we should appreciate what we have. And this is a prime example of what they don't have.
Well, yes. And you know, exactly. And we should be thankful that we can actually do stand-ups in the street and talk to people who dissent. I mean, I don't like violence, and I don't like people who break the law to demonstrate. But I actually really like the fact that you can demonstrate legally here without any repercussions. And that's something that, as you can see from some other clips that are floating around today out of Russia, that, I mean, they have cops standing around looking for somebody talking into a camera to arrest. And they're arresting people just as soon as they start talking into cameras. And that is actually a pretty good reminder of how fortunately we still have it here in the United States. Now, at the same time, you know, New York Times, the Washington Post, both reported over the last 24 hours that there's been a sort of a mass exodus coming out of Russia, right? Because people are afraid that they're going to get conscripted. People are afraid that they're going to close the borders. And they're trying to get out with whatever they still have left before that disappears as well, Andrew. And that includes a number of journalists that had been working for independent channels. They're setting up in Latvia, I think it is, either Lithuania or Latvia. And their mission now is to try to reconstitute these Russian language channels in a way that they can reconnect to their consumers in Russia. And this kind of takes us, everything in this crisis is taking us back to the Cold War. It's a return to the Cold War.
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, this was one of the big issues in the Cold War, is how do you get non-propaganda to Russians so that they know exactly what's going on. Here you've got, you know, Russians that are trying to do this, and at least as far as I've seen so far, I haven't seen a whole lot of efforts to bolster Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, if the latter even exists. I know Voice of America does. I mean, have you heard anything about this?
Yeah, RFE does. Yeah, yeah. Well, funny you should ask me, Ed. A number of years ago, I did my master's thesis on the problems of reporting from communist Poland. And that in those days, it was behind the Iron Curtain. And for Western correspondents to be there, and how they were followed and attempted intimidation and their sources and so on. So this is not a new phenomenon coming out of Moscow, unfortunately. It comes faster. I saw that there were thousands of Russians going into Turkey.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Istanbul specifically. And that's a fairly easy trek to make. right? I mean, if you're coming out of southern Russia, it's fairly easy to get into Turkey. And Turkey, of course, is at least partly Western oriented. So Istanbul is a pretty good jumping off location if you want to get all the way over to the west.
Turkey is also a NATO member.
It is also a NATO member. And the New York Times said there's probably uncounted thousands that are escaping to other parts of Central Asia that we just don't have a good, finger on that pulse. But just get back to your master's thesis in Poland. I mean, we've seen some of the, maybe we've sort of refreshed our memory here on how difficult it is, even if you get people to listen to these broadcasts, how difficult it is to get around the propaganda. And I think we've talked about this before, but I'm a big fan of William Sharer's books about World War II. And there's two books that he did in particular. One, of course, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, but the other is Berlin Diary. And in both of these, but especially in Berlin Diary, he talks about the fact that how much in the bubble he was in with Nazi propaganda. And even though he was entirely skeptical of anything the regime had to say for good reason, how much of it still informed his thinking. And so, I mean, what did you discover while you were doing this master's thesis?
Well, the attempted intimidation, they wouldn't give me a visa to go to Poland. The communist Poles in those days. But I did talk with many correspondents, mainly American, but some British, who had worked in Poland and the perils. Now, this would have been the mid 60s. So it still was the Cold War. And, this, with the fighting going on, this isn't the Cold War anymore. This is a hot war. And my image of this was formed when I was a teenager, and my family had friends in the Netherlands, a business associate of my father's, and we went to visit them in Rotterdam, a very nice family, and I'm still friends with their children. And the dad, when we arrived, I noticed the dad went over and turned off the radio to be polite, but before he turned it off, he changed the channel.
Oh, really?
This is like 1961 or something like that. And he pointed out to us that this was a habit ingrained from the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands. The Gestapo would come into the house to look around and look for anyone suspicious, and they would go over and put their hand on the radio. This is the old days when radios had tubes in them. And if they felt it was warm, they would turn it on and see what station it was on. And you would get arrested if it was not on a German station. Yeah. So to that day, what would have been like 16 years after the end of the war, he still instinctively changed the channel to a German station. And I thought that was, for a teenager, I was very impressed with that.
Well, it's impossible if you have been a teenager in 1961 because you're only 38 years old. So,
that's true. That's true. Well, yeah. Well, time flies.
Time does fly. It does fly, especially when we're doing these podcasts. But I think what's interesting, though, is how much it comes back around again. And we're seeing that right now. And I don't think that anybody, certainly before 2014, but I don't think anybody even really thought in 2022 that you'd be seeing really the Sovietization minus the communism of Russia at this late date. I think that people figured that the oligarchs would have too much sway over Putin, that they wouldn't want to have their business interests damaged. And that may still wind up being true. But in the meantime, we're really going back in Belarus and in Russia to that very same kind of abrupt media Iron Curtain.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's scary. What's also scary was this poll that came out, got overlooked for a week or so, but showed that only half of Americans would would be willing to fight for America if we were invaded.
Right.
The other half would flee. Good grief. What a sad comment on our education system that we don't teach the patriotism and the national spirit apparently sufficiently.
I called that the Red Dawn question. You know,
Yeah.
Cam Edwards and I were having this sort of like this lengthy debate over like the last 2 or 3 weeks on the on the VIP Gold chat about Red Dawn because I've always thought it was a ridiculous movie. And I know that I'm firmly in the minority on that opinion, but I said, you know, the thing is that as ridiculous as that was for Americans, Ukraine's really going through a Red Dawn moment right now.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a legit thing for them. But the difference is, of course, is that I don't know how you calculate the lines of communication that will allow a large army to invade the United States, you know, by surprise, right? unless you're thinking that it's Mexico and Canada that are doing it, which, you know, I guess is possible, I think. But you know, the Russians and the Cubans don't make a lot of sense. Neither does China, and especially not North Korea, which was the setup for the remake that was made because, you know, you can't show China being bad guys if you make a Hollywood movie.
What can you say? I mean, they're just stories. I'm watching this Jack Reacher series.
Yeah, I've heard good things about that.
Oh, yeah, it's very entertaining. And, you know, one of the reasons I think it's entertaining is because there's an indomitable good guy who's he doesn't talk much, but you can't beat him up. Now, I suppose you could shoot him, but that hasn't happened yet. We're only a few episodes in, but so whenever he comes, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, whenever he comes up against a confrontation, you have the comfort of knowing he's gonna win.
Yeah, it's sort of like Chuck Norris, right?
Chuck Norris, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Rocky. Rocky had to go way down before he came back up. That was the appeal, the comeback. Americans are suckers for comebacks.
Comebacks and redemption stories. Comebacks and redemption stories.
Underdogs. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Wow. Well, and that's the reason why I think that, I mean, honestly, that's one of the reasons why I think that we are so sympathetic to Ukraine. I mean, I think that Americans, despite all of our differences, despite all the, you know, all of the sharp divisions that we have, I think Americans across the spectrum recognize a good liberation fight. And clearly in Ukraine, that's what's going on here. So, yeah.
And the American Revolution, we were going up against the world's largest, best army.
Yep.
With a bunch of ragtag people who hid in the bushes and shot. I mean, that just violated all the rules of war. But we won, and guess who learned from that? Ho Chi Minh.
Right.
So, yeah, came back to bite our karma or something.
Yep, it's bite us in the butt, I think, is a good way of putting it. All right, let's move on to your column this week, the VIP column over at redstate.com. You are the regent of Red State, after all. A dangerous habit. Biden is late for everything except weekends away. You know, I noticed that this was true of Barack Obama, too. And I don't recall it being as true of Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump might be a few minutes late for press conferences and that sort of thing. But also Donald Trump was the kind of guy who, you know, would show up for the, you know, the opening of a can of beer. I mean, this is a guy who really wanted to be in front of the microphone
for a long time.
Yeah.
Remember in the campaign, when the campaign was winding down, the guy was doing 3 major rally speeches in 3 different states on one day. And Joe Biden was knocking off by 10 or 11 in the morning.
Yep.
Now, Bill Clinton was always late. I know I worked for George W. Bush and Laura Bush, and they were never late.
I was going to say, they were punctual. They were like...
Oh, it was a religion with them. And I think it came from Barbara Bush, who taught them a lot of things about political courtesy. For instance, when I would campaign with Laura Bush, and we would be in a small, like I remember being in Clear Lake, Iowa. Remember, and that's where the Big
Right.
Bopper died. So, and we took off from the same airport, but we would have a day of campaigning at people's houses and at Rotary clubs and whatever. And when the plane took off, it was my duty to give Mrs. Bush a list of people that we owed thanks to for that day, And on the way to the next stop, she would be writing hand notes or thank you notes in her own handwriting and addressing the envelopes. And they would be mailed by night of that day. Personal thank yous. We were in Council Bluffs one time, and Secret Service drove up to the door. It was 5 minutes early, and she said, no, I have to drive around the block. If we show up early, they'll be embarrassed because they won't exactly be ready. You could never be late, but you also couldn't be early. So we drove around a couple of blocks, came back, and according to Mrs. Bush's watch, boom, we were at the door on time, and the people were ready then to meet us. And they they remarked to me, some of the people later, that Bill Bradley had used that same venue the previous day, and he was over 2 hours late. It was winter, so a lot of people were waiting in the cold. And I mean, I'm not like Barbara Bush, obviously, but if you want to ask somebody for something as sacred as their vote, and you show up 2 hours late and go, listen, I'm so important, I'm late, but you have to understand. No, I'm sorry, it doesn't work. I wouldn't have waited 2 hours if I was a Bill Bradley supporter. So, yeah, it's just common courtesy.
Yeah,
and it works.
Well, I think it's it's part of that. It's that part of retail politics that I think a lot of politicians, candidates miss, right?
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's part of this whole being able to connect to voters. And I'm just going to go ahead and tie this to the the big news over the last couple of days is the DCCC chairperson, Sean Maloney, was trying to tell his fellow Democrats, we've really lost touch with voters. We're not speaking to them on terms that they want to make that connection. We're lecturing them. We're belittling them. We're talking past them.
Talking down.
Exactly. And needless to say, that warning didn't get a whole heck of a lot of cheer from the Democrats, congressional Democrats, on their retreat this weekend. But I mean, it really is the truth.
They'll get their butts shot off. One of my favorite tweets, it's an evergreen, is the one that comes out that says, "I'm determined to work and be less condescending to people." Parentheses, that means talking down to people.
I resolve to treat people as though they're intelligent. That includes you unwashed out there.
I'm gonna pretend that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's that that apocryphal quote that's been attributed to Samuel Goldwyn. That's clearly not. I mean, it's clearly apocryphal. So probably joking in the first place. But where he says sincerity is the key. Once you've got that, you can fake anything. So
if you can't fake, you can fake. Yeah, exactly. And he's also the one who's supposed to have said he had a movie that was a bomb, and they asked him what happened, and he says, "Well, if people don't want to come, you can't stop them."
Right.
I love little twists like that.
I mean, it's great.
The hell out of me.
But I mean, this is part of the problem with Joe Biden. It's not that he's just showing up late, right? It's that his message is way off.
He's late. He was 2 hours late. 2 hours late for a news conference at NATO last summer. Okay,
right.
He showed up late for that infamous meeting with Boris Johnson was chairing, and he started to make a point that they'd already covered, and Boris Johnson bluntly cut him off, which I think is good. But those people who were always chronically late, they never learn the lesson. They think they're too big for that. But Biden was late to detect there was a new variant in the Delta variant. Remember last summer?
Right. Yep.
They were late on that. He made the Afghan exit late. It was set by Trump, negotiated to be in April, which is before the peak fighting season starts. Biden postponed it to September 11th for some silly symbolic reason. And then he got so much criticism, he backed it up into August, which is the peak fighting season. And here comes the Taliban storming across the country. He rejected the general's advice that you're going to need 2,000 or 3,000 guys to monitor an evacuation. He ordered everybody out. Then they ordered 3 times as many people back in. They had to. He said he'd stay, but he didn't. He's late on just about everything. And they're consequential. He's late to send lethal arms to Ukraine. He stopped Poland from sending MiGs to Ukraine. He
was late on the sanctions, right? I mean, he was dragging butt on the sanctions. I mean, Europe was ahead of him on these things, and you'll hear people in the media, and I want to get to another media story, by the way, before we get to the end of the podcast today. But you'll hear people in the media say, "Well, it's good because it's showing that he's gathering a consensus, and Europe has to lead on this issue, and it's good that Joe Biden's letting them lead." It's like, not really. No, I mean, what's the point on that? I mean, we wanted to get them contributing, but it's American leadership that really should be out front here, if for no other reason to protect these same allies in Europe.
The same ones who came to our rescue with Article 5 when we were attacked and went into Afghanistan to get back. He's late. When have sanctions ever worked? They don't. They don't change behavior. They make people suffer, the regular people. But guess what? Kim Jong-un is not doing without champagne because of the sanctions. And Putin isn't doing without anything. Any Russian that still has a bank account in the United States deserves to lose it. I mean, come on.
Right, yeah.
Let's get serious about this. So all their money is in Cyprus. They moved all their boats to Spain and what have you. By the way, Ed, I think I'm going to become a Russian oligarch because they have nice boats.
Yeah, I've noticed that. They got really cool boats. I want to be a Russian oligarch when I grow up. I've got 3 choices now in front of me. When I grow up, I either want to be a Russian oligarch, a left-handed relief pitcher, or a place kicker in the NFL.
Yeah. Those are my. Now there's some pressure. Oh boy, yeah.
Well, there's a lot of pressure, but your uniform stays clean. You could play for 25 years.
Remember when I was a kid, and the Cleveland Browns were champions. The place kicker with Lou Groza, they went both ways. So Lou Groza was a tackle, and they would have to call a timeout, and he'd run off and change his regular cleats and put on his blunt-toed kicking shoe. To beat the Los Angeles Rams in the championship game in the last 30 seconds, their first year in the National Football League. But I won't get into that, Ed.
But you digress.
I digress. Yeah, exactly. So, So anyway, it's a cosmetic thing that they're late. They're just plain rude. But if they're late and they're in public office, they're arrogant, and it's dangerous. Do you have any confidence? I sure don't, that they're preparing for a Chinese attack on Taiwan.
No confidence whatsoever.
They'll be late. They'll be caught with their pants down on that too.
Yep.
And they'll try to cover it up, change the subject. It's disturbing that we have a guy who doesn't feel the normal strictures of a leader. He's not a leader, and he's a reactive president, reacting to things all the time. And he thinks, well, look, I had the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Well, but only after you screwed it up royally. So anyway, that's what the column was about, and I thought it was time to point out punctuality has, or lack of it, has a price.
It does. I want to ask you one real quick question before we get on to the jokes of the week, because that's always the fun part of this show. But but did you happen to see that ABC News poll on the that is related to the bill in Florida about restricting sex education to basic biology for pre to 3 kids in school, below 3rd grade and below. So ABC News has this poll. ABC News Ipsos has this poll, right? And it says only 6 of 10 Americans oppose this bill that is being passed in Florida. And then you go down about halfway through the report, and it says, by the way, this poll oversampled LGBTQ respondents, which we've modeled out. It's like, well, wait a minute. Oh, by the way, 59% of the non-LGBTQ respondents also oppose this. It's like, well, first off, how do you get an oversample of LGBTQ, right? Because the only way to do that, the only way to do that is to either identify the respondents you want to ask, or probably more likely, they've limited the pool to places where they could be reasonably sure of a robust LGBTQ response. So you're looking at urban centers, probably cities like San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, New York.
Wow, come on, Ed, that wouldn't skew things, would it?
Not at all, and also it was a national poll of 622 adults, not registered voters. 622 adults. I mean, this is a dumb poll. It's a completely unreliable model. But I mean, this is media polling is sometimes designed to serve a narrative rather than to actually take the temperature.
Exactly. To fit. And so much is molded to fit a narrative. I remember back in Watergate, the editors at the New York Times said, well, we want to go out and find out what small town America thinks about Watergate and Nixon. And I said, okay, well, what do you want the story to be about? And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, you want it that they support him or that they don't like him? And they said, oh, well, and I said, because if they want him to support him, I'll go to Nebraska. If you don't, I'll go to Madison, Wisconsin. You could, these things. So anyway, I went to Hastings, Nebraska, but that's a long time ago.
It's only yesterday, actually. And speaking of which, now it's time to get to the jokes of the week. Our late night contributions to lightening the mood here.
That's right, to lightening the nation's mood. Let's see. These are all replays. These are brought back from previous late night shows. Seth Meyers said that chocolate maker Hershey is reportedly expecting to cut its global workforce by about 15%. That's right. For the first time ever, chocolate is giving up people for Lent. I like that one. Another Myers replay is that the late fashion designer Karl Lagerfeld reportedly left part of his $125 million estate to his cat. Said the cat, "Oh, he died?" I love these things. Finally, another Seth Meyers is that a Virginia set of identical twin sisters will marry a set of identical twin brothers in a joint wedding this summer in Virginia. They're all registered at Kinko's.
Well, there you go. Copies. There you go.
That's right. So here we are on Tuesday, and we're lightening the national mood.
Lightening the national mood, as always. Andrew Malcolm, the Prince of Twitter, the Regent of Red State. You can find him at AH Malcolm on the Twitters, redstate.com, clearly, and he's usually in the VIP section, so you can check there as well. Andrew, thanks again. We'll talk to you next week.
Okie doke. Thanks, Ed. Thanks, everybody. See you then.
All right, folks, stay tuned for more from the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast edition. Joining me today to talk about what's going on in Iran with Russia and Rob Malley. What a name that I thought we might have put behind us about a dozen years or so ago. But no, that's not the case. And David Harsanyi is here to talk to us about that. He wrote a great piece over at National Review, one of my favorite places on the web, by the way. That's apart from, of course, all the town hall stuff. David, I have to go with the town hall stuff first, but National Review is right up there.
That's where the fishnagels come from. So yeah.
So nationalreview.com, and you're also on Twitter, right? Is it at David Harsanyi? Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, at David Harsanyi, my full name.
Harsanyi. All right, and David, now, Rob Malley is a name that people who have been paying attention for a while would recall, I think, from 2008 and 2009, because this was the guy who was on Barack Obama's campaign initially. He was a campaign advisor for Barack Obama until it came out that he was meeting with, or he had met with, Hamas, which is a designated terror group. And Barack Obama had to sort of dump him from the campaign, only to rehire him after he won the election. But he ran into a lot of resistance in terms of what he was trying to do back then. And I'm not sure how much he was able to actually affect. Now he's suddenly back in the Biden administration. How did that happen?
Well, I should mention that he was kicked off the the Obama team in 2008, but met with Hamas again in 2010 with a bunch of, Malley types,
right?
Who believe that Hamas is the key to negotiating peace in Israel. I was also taken aback because I never knew this until I researched this piece, that his dad was Simon Malley, who was this, and I don't say this lightly, a communist, self-proclaimed communist writer who lived in France, who was pro-Nasser, who was an Arafat advisor, who did all these things. Now, obviously, the son does not have to, just because your dad just believes terrible things doesn't mean you will. But in this case, he does. And it's kind of weird. Like, Malley wrote tons of articles, not tons, but many articles. He co-wrote with an Arafat advisor, and yet he was on the team to deal with Iran, obviously, something Israel does not support. But anyway, now I forget your question, but I think it was, what is he up to now?
Yeah, I mean, I know what he's up to, because I've actually mentioned too that Rob Malley's part of this effort to reinflate the JCPOA with Iran. But I'm curious as to why that's flown under the radar. I mean, certainly the Iran deal talks haven't flown under the radar, but why Rob Malley's involvement in it has kind of flown under the radar.
Well, frankly, I think there's so much going on that there just can't be this, focus from Republicans, at least, on the Iran deal and who's involved in it. When Obama was pushing for the Iran deal, there was a lot more pushback from Republicans, simply because I think there was a million other things going on at the time. And also maybe everyone just knows that this is what Biden was going to do, and in some weird way, it's an effort, I think, to save Obama's legacy as well, even though this is a deal is probably going to be worse if it goes through. Also, on top of that, what I don't understand, or why I don't understand there isn't more attention paid to this, and why there isn't more anger about this, is that we're literally working with the Russians to do it. Russians are the intermediary. They are making demands, sanctions, and we're still pushing through, even as Russia, destroys Ukraine. So that too is a weird thing that more people aren't upset about that.
Well, I agree. And I was just about to say, Rob Malley isn't really even the most objectionable part of this equation, right? Because you've got Mikhail Ulyanov, who is Vladimir Putin's envoy to the talks about renewing the JCPOA. And at the same time, when Putin is invading Ukraine and threatening NATO with nuclear drills, you've got the Biden administration apparently taking direction from Ulyanov, to the point where Ulyanov, in speaking with reporters in English, was bragging about how all the big wins that he was getting for Iran with the help of his partners from China, at the expense of the United States. I mean, this is, it's almost a parody.
We saw this with Obama. There was literally nothing that we won't give Iran to get this deal done. I mean, we essentially allowed them to do what they wanted in Syria. We sent them pallets of cash as a ransom, essentially, for people they were kidnapping. We let them demean our military and our soldiers. We let them kill our soldiers, 600 of them or more in Iraq, according to the Obama administration, were dead as a direct result of what the Iranians were doing. And yet we ignored all that just to sign this deal, which essentially gives them, at least I believe, a glide path to almost getting nuclear weapons that will make it very easy for them when certain things sunset to do it. And then you will have a country like Russia. Well, the reason we can't do anything about Russia is because it's a nuclear power, and it's pretty clear to anyone. Now imagine Iran is a nuclear power in the Middle East. And this is what I think John Kerry, I mean, this is just something I feel. There's no like hard evidence about this, but I feel there are a lot of people in the Obama administration and now the Biden administration that want a counterweight to Israel in the Middle East, a nuclear one. And that's why they're perfectly happy with Iran heading in this direction.
Well, David, I mean, I think it's even beyond that too. I think that they're actually trying to counter the wise policy of Donald Trump. And I'm not the biggest fan of Donald Trump, but the Abraham Accords was a smashing success for the United States. He got the Sunni states to start normalizing relations with Israel on the basis that that they needed a united counterweight in the region against Iranian expansion. And Iran's been pursuing an encirclement campaign against the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia for several years. The Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Assad in Syria. I mean, all of these are a larger strategy, which, and again, I have my doubts that this administration could recognize a strategy if it bit him in the ass, so to speak. Sorry for being blunt. But I mean, it's clear that Iran has this encirclement strategy around the major Sunni powers. And Biden seems to be jumping on the side of the Sunnis, or excuse me, of the Iranians against the Sunnis, and that came up this week. I mean, the consequences of that came up this week because Biden went to Saudi Arabia and UAE and asked to start talking about increased oil production. They basically told him to pound sand. They're not going to talk to him.
I mean, they didn't answer the call of the president of the United States, and yet they spoke to Putin the week before. That's incredible. People from Saudi Arabia is an ally of ours, and they're not answering the president's call, and it's because of what he's doing with Iran, because he's taking the Houthis and others off terror lists, because he's essentially going to give Iran what it wants. He's going to turn, I mean, in an inadvertent way. I mean, Obama pushed together Israel and the Sunni, in the Gulf states, but he's also inadvertently, Biden is going to push Saudi Arabia to get nuclear weapons itself. We're going to have a nuclearized Middle East, and that's not, who knows where that leads, right? So that is also dangerous, and it's incredible that we can't rely on the Saudis to give us more oil when we need it. I mean, an economic, we might be headed towards a recession. Obviously, it's going to be huge, inflationary pressures. So, yeah, it's a disaster of foreign policy. I mean, everyone keeps saying, "Oh, but Biden rallied all the allies together." Well, not the oil-producing allies we actually need to help us. So they don't count the Gulf state as allies, and they don't, frankly, even count Israel as an ally very much anymore in the Democratic Party. I don't think.
Well, I think you're right, and I think that this is a great example or a great demonstration of the value that they place on Israel's alliance, and for that matter, Saudi Arabia's alliance. I mean, Joe Biden went into office talking about how he was going to turn Saudi Arabia into a pariah state, and I mean, based on the Khashoggi murder, which is certainly despicable and is a stain on the Saudis to this day, and they're still not accounting for it. So I mean, that criticism is not illegitimate, but if you're going to make the Saudis a pariah state, as Joe Biden did, then you have to look at strategically, what does that mean? How do you compensate for the for the loss of that ally in the region, and not just in terms of the regional politics there, but in terms of your domestic politics, in terms of energy production. And there was all this Biden's apologists were out there saying this is awful. We should cut off arms sales to Saudi Arabia. We should throw out their ambassador, all sorts of different things. And I mean, my answer to that was, what did they expect to have happen? Yeah, it's not great to deal with the Saudis, but unless you're willing to produce all of our own oil and especially have it remain scalable in times of emergency, you're going to need to deal with people who can produce. I just, again, a strategic.
Yeah, I mean, you on one hand, you're inhibiting production, right? I mean, from day one, that's what Biden did. I mean, they keep pretending, oh, there's nothing that can happen in the next few months. All right, fine. I mean, how about the next price shock or whatever? I mean, he has no interest in doing that. He's obviously worked against it. But more than that, it doesn't make sense. The Khashoggi murder, unjustified and terrible. But the murder of 600 Americans doesn't seem to bother anyone. And the Iran deal at the same time, we're going to Venezuela to try to get oil from them, or frankly, lifting Trump-era sanctions on Russians sending oil to Europe. So this idea that we're fighting for democracy and then going to Iran and empowering Venezuela potentially, it doesn't really make sense. And it's just shows what hypocrites they are. I mean, they favor Iran over Saudi Arabia because of Khashoggi and other things that bother people within the Beltway, and that's fine. I don't, it's a petro theocracy, that right. I wish wasn't the way it was, but the world is the way it is, and we can't just change it because we tweet, we hashtag about it, and if you're not going to make sure that your relationship with the Gulf states is strong, then this is what's going to happen. It's OPEC plus now. Russia has a big say in what happens with OPEC. We have almost no say. So, yeah, I mean, listen, people talk about energy independence. I don't think when you have a fungible commodity, it's never going to be completely that way, but you can do a lot of things to alleviate their power over us. And literally every climate bill is about making gas and oil and energy in general more expensive here. So why are we pretending that that's not what they want to do? That's what Democrats want to do. I mean, it's just a fact.
Right. And you, in fact, you wrote about this in a separate piece this week. Let them drive Teslas, because this was, the original response to the high gasoline prices prior to the invasion of Ukraine. At which point it became Putin's spike, right? And all of a sudden the messaging was, oh, this is Putin's spike. It's Putin's inflation. But prior to that, it was like, well, we know gas prices are going up, but hey, if you drove a Tesla, you wouldn't care. As though the energy that powers Teslas is completely disconnected from the price of fossil fuel. It's absurd. And again, it's sort of this dishonest presentation of energy policy that is, you can extend that to economic policy in general. Transitory inflation is good for you. What is that? Rick Santelli had a rant this morning about this, about all the different excuses, and now Putin's the latest excuse. Let them drive Teslas. Tell us a little bit about the electric vehicle issue here that you wrote about so well.
I have nothing against technology. If electric cars worked, I'd be fine with it. I probably actually would prefer a gas powered car, but whatever, I don't care that people have them. But the idea, I think I forget what these numbers are. So if I get them a little bit off, it is what it is. But I think it's like 1.2% of our fleet is electric cars today. I want, this after sort of throwing in billions of dollars of subsidies, helping these companies get off the ground, all these things, it's 1.2, and the cars are basically, for the most part, unaffordable for a normal family somewhere in the Midwest who has 4 kids or 3 kids or anything like that. I mean, it's going to cost you like $600 a month. And why get rid of the car you have? But it's just so immature and stupid. I can't even believe we have to talk about it. I mean, you have 280 million cars out there. What are you going to do? How quickly can you replace that fleet? How quickly can you replace the entire infrastructure of how we how we power our vehicles? I mean, this could take decades to do, even if we wanted to do it. I'm pro gas. I think it's the most portable, most efficient, and cheapest energy we have. So I don't even know why we have these conversations. But I just quickly want to say, I mean, this has nothing to do with market forces, right? No one's like, there's not a huge clamoring for electric cars. This has to do with the government and technocrats within it telling us what we're going to drive. So they, as I wrote in the piece, the only difference between these people say go drive a Tesla and Marie Antoinette is that she actually never said let them have cake, eat
Right.
cake. They are, and I think it's so tone deaf, right? I mean, I am not some political strategist, but I just can't imagine someone in Ohio hearing that and saying, yeah, you know what, if we had a Tesla for 70K, we wouldn't have to worry about gas prices today. It was just, and as you said, where do they think that energy comes from? Nearly 80% of our power is generated through fossil fuels or nuclear, none of which they want anymore. It's just,
Right.
it's just so immature and ridiculous. And I don't really get it as a political strategy.
Well, David, I kind of figure it's coming from this sort of academic bubble that James Carville has warned Democrats that they are spending far too much time in. These are the types of arguments that sound good in the faculty lounge, and I use faculty lounge specifically because that was actually Carville's term for it. But it doesn't work in the real world, because in the real world, people understand that you can't have a car that can only go 70 miles on a charge and then needs to charge overnight in order to fully charge up, unless you buy a supercharging station that will cost you several $1,000s. It's not practical. I actually have no problem with electric cars either. I wouldn't even mind driving one if I lived in an urban environment where you didn't have to travel too far, and you could leave the thing on the charger overnight and not have to worry too much about range. But if you're not living in
someone
the
pointed
cities,
out to me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but someone pointed out to me, most people in urban areas want these, right?
Right.
But think about Manhattan. Where are you going to charge all these cars in a city with old buildings that don't have chargers anywhere? Like,
right.
it's like impossible to even charge them. It works in suburbs. It doesn't work in rural areas. It doesn't work in urban areas yet. Maybe one day it will, whatever. I mean, but it's not a legitimate answer to the problems we're dealing with. It's just preposterous.
No, I agree. But I mean, if you're going to have that type of infrastructure, the first place it's actually going to appear is in urban areas, because of the density and because of the shorter travel that typically occurs in those cities. Maybe Los Angeles being the exception, just because it's so large geographically. But
what are they going to do when they're stuck in traffic for 3 hours? I mean,
right.
These cars are going to die in traffic jams. Anyway, I just don't.
Or Chicago for that matter.
Practical problem. Yeah.
I grew up in Los Angeles, so I hear you on Los Angeles. I've tried to travel through Chicago, and I would say Chicago's got the same problem. Yeah, good luck in an electric car going across Chicago. But I mean again, it's sort of this this unreal, disconnected viewpoint, very much elitist. I mean, this is sort of almost archetypally elitist thinking that you're writing about, and let them drive Teslas.
Absolutely. It's but it is weird that Biden, who sort of fashions himself as this champion of the sort of working class, I mean, doesn't get that this message won't resonate anywhere. And I assume it won't resonate anywhere. And maybe he's just too old to like understand that anymore or whatever, but it does not comport with his usual shtick, or his usual rhetoric. And but they've like leaned into it. I've seen like 3 people in the administration basically say, if you had an electric car, you wouldn't have to worry about gas. It's just insanity. And I think most people understand that. And it's one of the reasons I think most people, when gas goes to $6-7 a gallon this summer, summer's always when gas gets higher, they're not going to blame Putin. I think in the end, they're going to want to blame someone, and the closest person to blame is going to be the president.
Right. I agree. And again, this is this disconnect between what Democrats assume is important, their agenda, and the actual daily lived experience of Americans, which, when it comes to elections, matters a lot more. And, Republicans made this mistake in 2018, right? They, mostly driven by Trump, they ran on an immigration platform, which really didn't relate to what their concerns were in that election. Healthcare was more of it, because Republicans had sort of botched they had botched the Obamacare repeal, and they didn't have a plan, and it made everybody insecure about where their health care situation was. And Democrats had a very effective message on health care in that midterm and did really well. I think you're going to see that same thing here. What people are experiencing on a daily basis is inflation, wage erosion, crime, and that's those sorts of daily things. And Democrats are still going to be talking about electric cars and build back better, and that's what Carville's warning them about. That's the trap they're walking themselves into.
It's like climate change is a concern of people who are doing relatively well and don't have to worry about inflation, energy prices, things like that. And inflation is the sort of thing that's embedded in literally everything people do. And when inflation happens, they even see it where it isn't because they're just nervous about it, and they plan for it and all of those things. And it just has a domino effect, I think. And it's just terrible. A terrible political price will be paid for it. Now, I'm not a person who believes that Biden can just sign a bill and stop inflation, or that he's at fault for everything that's going on. But I think compounding his problems are lying about it, saying Build Back Better costs zero after passing a $2 trillion bill. I mean, people aren't idiots. They know that pumping money into the economy causes more inflation. And all these sort of economic lies, and now with the Tesla thing and on, I think that disconnect actually goes back to the start of his administration. And now there'll be a price to pay because literally nothing. I mean, what is going well? If I ask someone what's going well in America right now, what would they tell me? I don't think they'd have a lot to say, right?
Nope.
And a lot of that is just economic and tied to economic problems. So, I mean, you can tell them, all these jobs came back. Yeah, but they were crushed by state mandates and lockdowns that crushed these jobs. They should easily come back. You have managed that bounce back terribly as far as, and Republicans as well probably will take some blame for that. But, the man in charge is usually who takes the most.
It's the quarterback. The quarterback takes the loss, right? The quarterback takes the loss. Yeah. All right, David Harsanyi, thank you so much for being with us today. Just remind everybody where they can find you once again.
Most of my stuff's at National Review, occasionally at the New York Post, and I'm on Twitter at David Harsanyi.
At David Harsanyi and National Review, the Post, New York Post. Be sure to check that out. David, again, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, at any time. Thanks for having me.
All right, stay tuned, folks. There's more coming up from the Ed Morrissey Show.